All right, class, let's get going with our first boards from the modern era. So our topic here is the modern era, 1750 to 1900. Our essential question, how did the revolutions of this time period change the world? So the two revolutions that I'm talking about in particular is the American Revolution and the French Revolution. So first, the American Revolution. Now, we're not going to cover this a lot because obviously it's covered in AP US history or just US history in general. But to sum it up, the English and the French were fighting. It was called the 7 Years' War in Europe. Here in North America, it was called the French and Indian War. Same war, 1763, which the English won. It expanded its borders in North America, and we're talking primarily around the area of the Great Lakes region. Then you had the Boston Tea Party in April of 1775 to protest the British taxes on the colonists, such as the Stamp Act 1765 and the Tea Tax of 1773. These taxes were just placed upon the colonists to try to raise revenue to pay for the war. And the more taxes that the colonists had to pay, the more upset that they got. You know, the old no taxation without representation. Finally, the British troops attacked at Lexington and Concord up in Massachusetts, 1775, and kind of got things going with the American Revolution. Thomas Paine publishes Common Sense, which persuades people into freedom. So at this time, persuades people into freedom. In 1776, Declaration of Independence and fighting moves to the south. French joins in with them. British army is surrounded. 1781, the war finally ends. 1789, the Constitution is written. So Thomas Paine, many of the people at this time were against going, against petitioning for freedom, and they wanted to remain a British colony. And so when Thomas Paine started writing, it got a lot of people on board to the idea of independence from Great Britain. From that point, the fighting took place in and around like present-day D.C. and Pennsylvania, but then started moving south. But then once the French got on board, because the French always were fighting with the English, and their Navy was able to help us with troop transport and for goods and for just military advantage, we were able to get our army going and overwhelm the British. So in 1789, Constitution was written for the United States. Now, during the American Revolution, the many French that came over to fight then went back to France, and they started to talk in amongst themselves, in particular about King Louis XVI. He was a absolute ruler in France, but he was not a very good or strong leader. France was in serious financial debt, mostly from wars and previous kings overspending, like on things like the Palace of Versailles. So these new ideas that the French military and Navy took back to France really kind of sparked ideas because when the French Revolution took place, these ideas were then put forth to help them in their revolution. So during the rule of King Louis XVI, he must raise taxes. There's three different social classes called the Three Estates. All taxes were paid by the Third Estate. So over here I got this like little thought bubble. The first estate was the clergy, and they made up about 1% of the people. The nobility made up about 2% of the people. And then you had everyone else, which made up 97% of the people. And it's this 97% of the people that had to pay all the taxes to support the wealthy. Not very fair, quite unfair. So these, no taxation without representation kind of idea, this Third Estate, they did not, they started to become much more enlightened. They were using Enlightenment ideas, and they finally, said enough's enough. So the Estates General is called together to help raise taxes. The king needs taxes, or he's literally going to go bankrupt. The Estates General is like a parliament. But this Estates General, strong and educated Third Estate, leaves the Estates General and forms the National Assembly. So the Estates General is called, but the Third Estate said, we're done. We're not going to get to be able to vote and have representation because the First and Second Estate will always outvote us. So we're just going to form our own, government. And they called it the National Assembly. They wrote the Declaration of Rights of Man using Enlightenment ideas. They started getting violent. It all wasn't nice. So all in all, I would have to say the French Revolution was not necessarily like the American Revolution in that we revolted against another country. The French Revolution to me is more like a civil war. Taking place in Paris, you had the fall of the Bastille. The Bastille was a huge prison that kind of stood for all the king's negative ways in which he was able to manipulate people. The fall of the Bastille in Paris, in turmoil. The king is brought back to Paris from Versailles. So he'd been Versailles about 10 or 12 miles southwest of Paris. He's brought back to Paris from Versailles and kind of put under house arrest. The National Convention, you have two different political parties that are primarily in control, just like, we have like the Democrats and Republicans. They have the radical Jacobians and the moderate Girondins. They kind of battle it out, and the Jacobians win. And they bring about the Reign of Terror. And during this Reign of Terror, a young man named Robespierre, he becomes like the leader. He leads up the Committee of Public Safety, and then anybody who's against the French Revolution, boom, they deserve to be killed or imprisoned. And that's when they thought up the old guillotine and started chopping people's heads off right and left. King Louis XVI is beheaded. See you later, King. As well as his wife, Marie Antoinette. And she was from Austria. So this Austrian princess has her head chopped off by the revolution. It obviously didn't make people in Austria too happy. And so then France starts to go to war with Austria and some of its surrounding neighbors. During this Reign of Terror, where Robespierre is in charge at the Committee of Public Safety, there's not much safety there, kills thousands until the Thermidorian reaction. The Thermidorian reaction is when they finally took Robespierre out of power. At that point, a directory, an executive branch of the government is written into another new constitution. I think this is like their third or fourth new constitution. But it has many problems. The directory has many problems, financial problems. And finally, in about 1799, Napoleon overthrows the government and leads as first consul, which means dictator, not first consul anything. He's like a dictator, a military dictator. Napoleon was able to initiate many reforms, such as Napoleonic Code, which in some respects is still applicable even to this day. As a great military mind, he attacked and conquered almost all of Europe. Napoleon's three big mistakes. The first is that he tried to form a blockade of Great Britain because that was his biggest foe during this time. That didn't work. Guerrilla warfare in Spain. So when he took over Spain, the Spaniards continued to fight guerrilla warfare style, which cost hundreds of thousands of men from the French army. And then his perhaps biggest mistake is that he tried to attack Russia. Russia burned down their cities as they pulled back, and it left nowhere for the troops of France to, bed down during wintertime, and literally thousands of men just froze to death, and they're just frozen. So anyway, after they died, they retreated. The majority of his army died and froze to death. They retreated, and it was at this point that Napoleon lost a series of battles. The last one was the Battle of Waterloo, and then he gets shipped off by the British down to the South Atlantic to finally die on some small island way, way down there. So anyway, the loss at the Battle of Waterloo put Napoleon out. France restores its monarchy to the throne, and it had limitations because they weren't going to go for the absolute monarchies that they had in the past. Now, coming out of all of this warfare was the Congress of Vienna. The Congress of Vienna set up to prevent any other European country from taking over on a huge scale, such as Napoleon and France. Three big key players in this was von Metternich from Austria, Alexander I from Russia, and Duke of Wellington from Great Britain. So these were some of the key players in the Congress of Vienna. And they tried to erase all the advancements there should be a T there, brought about by the Enlightenment and through the French Revolution and Napoleon. So as Napoleon and the French Revolution, as it spread throughout Europe, so did many of the ideas. The monarchies were put back into place, but the seeds of the Enlightenment and nationalism had been planted. Remember, history is no mystery. Take good notes.